like one part of the tissue will be getting full of water pressure, or it'll become turgid or turgor pressure. And then the other aspect of the tissue will be less pressure. And that allows the plant to move its body in context to what's happening to it. And so the leaf tissue, if leaves are going to move quickly or even modestly slowly, there's usually tissue either at the leaf, at the end of the leaf blade, or in the petiole area, which is like the leaf little stem, petiole, where they call it pulvini tissue. And it's just that area that tends to do this, where it can gain and lose water pretty rapidly. And so here with the mimosa plant, the sensitive plant, this is where you have all these leaflets. And so it's at the base of the leaflets that you have these pulvini. That's the plural, pulvinus is singular. And so here it's rapid turgor pressure when you touch a leaflet, and then all of a sudden you see all the leaflets in that leaf will start to collapse quickly. And it's because of this rapid shift in turgor pressure that causes the ability of those leaflets to actually fold together. And so the redwood sorrel can do that too, but the sensitive plant is probably the most famous. There's lots of videos online. I put some in here too for you to look at. And so that is a fairly rapid response to being touched, but there can be other more slower turgid movements, I guess, where you have even flower parts are able to do this with changes in turgor pressure. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. It's really interesting because it helps them get pollinated correctly. And I'll point that out in a minute here. But first, let's finish with the pulvini idea. So here's a mock-up of the sensitive plant. And they're trying to show at the leaf base of the leaflet that you can have this pulvinus region. So all this gridded region there is the pulvinus tissue. And if you get some aspect of that tissue gaining hydrostatic pressure and the other not, or actually losing, that can cause the movement of the leaflets. And it can be quite rapid. And so the plants are able to create situations where they can get an inrush of water. And they usually do that. I'll just basically say they usually do that by manipulating how much solutes they have in those cells that causes water to rush in. And so it's a fairly low energy cost and fairly straightforward for them to do quite rapidly. You've seen this picture already. This is another one just trying to show that you have this differential. Some cells get very good water pressure, some don't, and that causes the movement. So those can be fairly rapid, like with the mimosa plant. Here's another idea though, where you're looking at a flower, and we're certainly going to get into flowers later in the semester, but this area right in the middle that looks kind of fuzzy, that is the stigma of the flower. That's the part of the female portion of the flower. That's the portion that is going to be accepting pollen grains. And so pollen grains will land on here somehow, either by maybe a bee brushing its pollen-filled dusted body across it or whatever. But in this state, the stigma is receptive to the pollen. But look at the difference to the next slide now. We can see it's closed up. Okay, so this is the unreceptive state. It's not accepting any pollen here. So here it is, open, and here it's closed. And so some plants will do this, especially if they are perfect, what we call perfect flowers. Perfect flowers have both male and female structures. So sometimes you don't want to self-pollinate. That's not really always optimal. Or so sometimes they'll time it where maybe the male portion of the flower can release its pollen first, but the female will be unreceptive. So maybe that's what's going on here, where the male is releasing pollen and the female part is like, I don't want to be self-pollinated, so I'm going to close up. But then once the pollen's gone, they can open up the stigma And so that is a strategy to try to get pollen grains from another nearby plant and mix up the genes.
Could it be like a flight or bites on the response or no?
No, it's usually tied to pollen release, where they see that process happening in the flower. So we'll talk a lot more about flowers when we get into the angiosperms.
So like that, parent, is that still good or preferred? Depends on the parent.
It just has to, you have to sit there and get the flower for quite long. Fun, but you'd have to wait a little while. Okay. And what else do we have? Oh, let's talk about this one. This is a Turgor movement too, Nyctinasty. So we did seismonasty last week. We said like a seismic graph for earthquakes. Nycta refers to, I think, nighttime. I think is what that means. And so these are what they call sleep movements that some plants do. And this is still being investigated. They don't have it all nailed down, but they can see some plants will have their leaves or their flower petals fold in a certain way at night. Almost like they're going to sleep, and then they'll open up, so to speak, during the day. So here you're looking at a plant, this is called the prayer plant, because when it folds up its leaves, it tends to fold them upright, like two hands praying. And so at night, it would do that. And then during the day, of course, it wants to do photosynthesis, so it will try to fully open its leaves so it can get really good access to sunlight. I bought a prayer plant once, and I don't know, I think it was a mutant. I'd stay up past midnight looking at that thing, and it never did the, so I'm like, maybe it's not really a prayer plant, maybe they mislabeled it, I don't know. Looked like a prayer plant, so I couldn't get mine to, and maybe it was too much ambient light, I don't know, but I couldn't see it happen. But I have seen it happen with bean plant leaves. I've gone into the greenhouse late at night and there'd be bean plants growing, and I walked in and I'd see, instead of going up, they tend to droop down. And I'm like, oh no, they're wilting, they're gonna die, I've gotta water them. And I go and feel the pot and it's all moist. And then I'm like, oh, they're probably doing the Nyctinasty movement. And so they don't know exactly like why the prayer plant necessarily does this. There has been some speculation with bean plants because it's a crop plant, where they think at night bean plants will tilt. So if there's a heavy rain, the rainwater won't stay and pool on the leaves, where then fungi can blow in and start causing problems. And so they think it's a way for runoff. And they, tropical plants do that too. If you've looked at or had the luxury of being in a tropical rainforest, I have not done that, but that's why a lot of leaves will be kind of tilted, and they have a nice tip at the nice shape at the tip, which allows for water runoff so that you don't get pooling water. Fungi are the #1 cause of disease for plants. Out of fungi and bacteria and viruses, fungi win. There's more fungi out there that will attack a plant. So I'm trying to keep the mold away. So they're not, they are paying attention to this rhythm of day, night. And we'll get into a little bit of how they're assessing light, but plants can essentially tell how long they're in the light and how long they're in the dark. And that's super important for plants, because if you are a plant living your life out, just out free, you have to be able to assess, especially in this area, you have to be able to assess when winter's coming. And then you have to figure out, when should I flower so that I can get my seeds good to go before winter hits. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But here is, I think this is bean, where you can see the plant leaves are tilting down at night. There's also sunflower fields, if you've had the joy of driving by them and seeing them all facing the same direction. It's so cute looking. So this is the idea of solar tracking. Sunflower plants are famous for this. And so they are literally tracking the sun. And it's usually very obvious because they're kind of turning their whole body, including the flower. And so they're all facing the same direction here in this big sunflower field. So we mentioned before that plants like to have their leaves about 90 degrees to the incoming sun or light. And so they'll try to shift their petiole to turn their leaves to do that. And that's essentially what the sunflower plants are doing, and many other plants too. The fancy word for that is heliotropism. Helios is sun. That means sun. So heliotropism is, movement in response to the sun. So it's not just sunflowers that do this. There's all kinds of plants that are living out that, depend on the sunlight and not some artificial light that will track the sun. And in fact, they're pretty good. They can actually, at night, there's many, many plants that will rotate during the night so that they're ready to go as soon as the sun comes up. So they've done experiments with this to demonstrate that this is possible. And so here's a plant where the sun is, I think they did this artificial to show the data in the lab where they had the light shifting like the sun, rising and then high noon and then sunset. And so if the screen is north, let's say that's north, so that's south, north, south, so that's west, and that's east, so the sun comes up in the east. So they would, already during the night, they turn to get their leaves 90 degrees. And then as the sun rises, they keep tracking as it's high noon, they're trying to be pretty much horizontal, and then they shift. And then at sunset, they go all the way back through the night to get ready for the next day. And so, again, this is, how they say plants can sense time and can figure out where to be in order to capture that sunlight energy. Because if you're a plant, you want that sunlight energy striking you as soon as possible. As soon as the sun comes up, you want to be ready to go because your goal is to do photosynthesis as long as you can that day. And who knows, you might have some drought going on where you're going to have to stop photosynthesis. You take advantage of it as, quickly as you can. And so they're trying to show this idea of the leaves moving in response to the sun tracking across the sky. If you've ever been out walking in a field of tall grasses in a drought period, you might have noticed this, where the leaves will actually roll up along their length. And that's usually when they're doing that, it's typically because they're sensing drought. And so there are special cells called bulliform cells that will do this Turgor movement again to allow the leaves to kind of roll up along their length. And they're doing that just to try to conserve water, minimize water loss, and just kind of reduce their surface area, hide away their stomata. And so if you're out and walking or hiking this summer during a drought period, look for that because that's a really nice strategy. Pretty simple, just Turgor movements to allow them to try to make their body smaller and hide their stomata. Okay. So light, of course, is very, very important to the plant, especially if they're living their life out free and not in a greenhouse or under some artificial light. So if you recall back maybe in middle school or high school, if you ever did that experiment in science class where they put white light through a glass prism and then it broke into the different rainbow colors. So that's kind of what you see here. And really the different rainbow colors are different wavelengths of light. And so starting at the longest wavelength, so this is in nanometers, so 800 nanometers roughly is where you see red light, and then the colors of the rainbow, if you recall, it's red, orange, yellow, green, blue, Usually we put indigo and a little I, indigo and violet. Because some people leave off the indigo. But anyway, so red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet, you can see as you go into shorter and shorter wavelengths, okay? And the way I remember some people say Roy G. Biv, but the way I remembered it when I was learning it, ROY is a guy's name, Roy, and that was actually my dad's name, so that was really easy. And then my dad was an avid Packer fan, so Green Bay is victorious. So that's how I remembered it. Never, and here we are decades later, it stuck. So we have this idea that different wavelengths of light are striking the plant body. And so that certainly got the scientists asking, can plants tell the difference between some of these qualities of light, these different nanometer wavelengths? And the answer is yes. And so phototropism, we've talked about already, with this idea that the plant will bend toward unidirectional light coming and striking their body so that they can get their leaves roughly 90 degrees to that light. So they asked the question, is the plant responding to all the wavelengths or not? And they did a series of experiments and they realized the plant is actually picking up on blue light. And then they went hunting in the plant body and they found a photoreceptor that is tuned in to blue light. And so it's tuned in to the wavelengths roughly around, 420, 450 nanometers. That's the quality of light that photoreceptor is adapted to maximally absorb, and it kind of ignores all the other wavelengths of light. And it kind of makes sense that the plants use this difference in wavelengths to cue them. I mean, that's pretty neat adaptation that they can tell these wavelengths apart, and it can tell them different things to do and to respond in a certain way. And so the photoreceptor they identified and they named it phototropin. That's the name of the photoreceptor. And it perceives this blue light, and that's what's telling auxin, so to speak, hey, shift over to the dark side so you can stimulate growth on that side so that you can bend toward the light and get nice 90-degree sunlight striking the leaves. And so they have, since I think phototropism was one of the first, when they looked for the photoreceptor, the phototropin is probably one of the earliest discovered. And because they were very interested in this phototropism idea.
Do some grow lights, purple.
So purple is like the LED lights, they often look purple. And it's often because it's red and blue light that's shining and it gives that purpley hue when taken together. And so a lot of LED lights are ramped up in the red quality and the blue quality of light. And if you mix those together, it looks purplish to our photoreceptors.
Well, is growth through auxin the only way for plants to move?
No, I mean, other hormones cause growth too. It's not just auxin. But so like gibberellins certainly cause growth. Cytokinins cause growth. Yeah, it's just auxin is very famous for being in the shoot tip. And so it's very good at doing shoot growth.
Yeah, so growth that is the only way for them to move.
No, the turner movement too.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, turner.
So for like in agricultural greenhouses, let's see where it's like the red light. Red day or vice versa.
Yeah.
That's supposed to trigger different responses from plants and vegetables.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, you can shift the quality and length of light exposure to keep the plant in its vegetative state so it won't flower. Or you can shift that and trigger flowering. As long as they've gone through their juvenile phase, then they will flower in response to light. We're going to get into that, like how to manipulate that a little bit. But this graphic, by the way, where you see this absorption peak. So this is trying to show that the phototropin, this is the absorption peak for phototropin receptor. And it's just trying to show that it maximally absorbs in this quality of light. That's what it's adapted to absorbing. It doesn't really pay attention to anything beyond 500, for example. The other thing that blue quality light will tell the plant to do is to, open their stomata. And so again, if you can imagine, the plant during the night has shifted, so it's facing sunrise, and then the sun comes up, they want to immediately open their stomata if they're not doing a drought period. They want to open their stomata so they can immediately start taking in the carbon dioxide so that they can do photosynthesis. So certainly you want your body hit with light for photosynthesis, but the other key thing is you have to take in CO2 to fully do photosynthesis. So again, they discovered that it's the blue quality of light that the stomata are responding to and are able to open their stomata in that blue quality. So here they're just trying to show that they took these young seedlings and they, for phototropism, they did unidirectional light of different wavelengths. And they're trying to show that, red didn't work, they didn't respond, orange, yellow, green didn't work, but blue did. And so very simple experiments, nothing too fancy, but you can get at the idea of what quality of light causes that, in this case, phototropism, bending pattern. Okay, so this brings up the idea that plants have this ability to sense this photoperiodism, which is how long am I in the daylight versus dark? And this has been an ongoing decade-long search for how plants are doing this. I mean, they've witnessed it. Charles Darwin was the first to describe it, but then trying to gather the data and figure it all out took decades and decades. And so what it turns out to happen is that when the scientists started getting all this data, they started grouping plants into primarily the most interesting aspect for the scientists. They wanted to know, when do plants decide to flower? Because from a human perspective, that's super important for food production. So they were trying to figure out, why do some plants flower earlier in the summer, some wait until fall, what's going on? And they started grouping plants the more they studied. And so, for example, there's a group of plants that are known to be so-called short day plants, which means that they're not going to flower unless the day length is shorter than some critical period. And I have down in the notes section, like cannabis, the hemp plant does that, asters, poinsettias, ragweed, strawberries, they're all considered short day plants. I'll explain this a little bit more in a minute here. And then they grouped some plants. They said, oh, some plants seem to be long day plants. They're not going to flower unless the period of light is longer than some critical period.
So for the short day plants, are those considered like olive drops?
No, not quite. But you can get hemp plants that are that way, but typical hemp plants are considered like short day plants for flowering. So then, do I have yeah, okay. Okay, so an example of a short day or long day plants, I put down in the notes section, beets, which is sugar beets, that's how we get a lot of our sugar. Lettuce, potatoes, spinach, wheat, they're all long day plants. Okay, so here's an example of some data, an experiment that they did. So here is the beautiful poinsettia plant. And really, I zoomed in here because it's a little bit of a misnomer. This yellow that you see in the middle, those are the flowers. All this red stuff, these are so-called bracts. They're just very modified leaves with that very intense red pigment. Well, in this case, red. Poinsettias can be different colors now, but So, but anyways, so, but taken together, that looks like a cluster of really big flowers, but really it's not. So it's just nice fancy bracts, and then the flowers are actually quite tiny. But anyways, we like this one. We like to have poinsettias in our home around the Christmas or holiday season, right? So if you are a grower of poinsettias, you got to time this so that they're ready for sale during that period, because otherwise you're going to miss your window. Attraction. They want, it's for pollinators to come pollinate. It's like advertising. So it says here, the poinsettia with the flowers received less than 8.5 hours of light per day. The green ones received more than 10 hours of light per day. So obviously you got to know that if you're growing poinsettias for profit, and you have to time it so that they will be in full bloom around the holiday season. I was listening to a NPR around the holiday season several years ago. They were talking to someone who grows poinsettias in large greenhouses, you know, where it's like big business. So, I mean, this is big business. And the owner of this business had a relatively young or new employee, and the employee didn't get that training of you got to keep them in less than 8.5 hours. And he came in one evening after sunset and he turned on the light in one of the greenhouse rooms. That's all it took. They refused to flower in time. So that whole greenhouse batch was toast. And the NPR interviewer said, "Oh, I bet you fired him." And I was really surprised, because the business owner said, "No, I didn't." He said that employee will never forget that. He'll never do that again. So he learned his lesson, and I kept him on. And, you know, I'm like, well, that's great that, you know, he allowed a whoops, even though it cost a lot of money. So,
Be a good tax write-off.
well, maybe, yeah, maybe, but I was impressed. It's like, okay, that's nice that he didn't get fired. So, I mean, this is something that you have to do. Like if you have poinsettias in a greenhouse, you have to have blackout curtains, you know, in order to make sure that no, or be in an area where there's no light coming in, which is hard to do in this day and age. So you got to know what your plants are in terms of, you know, what's the critical night length or day length. So then they discovered there are some intermediate day plants, which just means you're not going to flower if the day is too short or too long. It kind of reminds me of what is that? Pardon? Yes, thank you. I'm not the only one who thinks that. Good. Okay, so yeah, Goldilocks. You know, this one's too hot, this one's too cold. This one's just right. So the intermediate, I have grasses like to be, which kind of makes sense because a lot of grasses are in tropical, like the equator, which it is pretty much equal day and night periods at the equator. Okay, all year round. And day neutral plants, that means either they haven't figured it out yet, or will not flower under any day length, provided there is minimum amount of light necessary, or will flower, I'm sorry, will flower under any day length. So they call them day neutral. So day neutral, again, tropical plants, which I guess makes sense again, because they're right on the equator area. Beans, carnations, roses, tomatoes, cotton. So you can see that, you know, they've really kind of honed in. They're really interested in plants that are being used for crop production, is where they really started building this database of what kind of plants are these. So this idea of flowering was a big, you know, like, how do they know to do that? When to do it? And it turns out they're actually able to tell how long am I in the light versus the dark. And then they also know that this same system is allowing them to also prepare, if they live in this kind of area that has 4 seasons, it's allowing them to make sure they flower in time, set seed in time, disperse their seeds in time, and then prepare for winter. And then, of course, survive the winter, and then in the spring, get ready to go again. So, you flowering kind of goes hand in hand for, at least around here, preparing for the seasons as well. Okay. So now we got to talk a little bit about how are they doing this? How are they able to tell which, how long am I in the light versus the dark, or oops, I'm in the dark, I better do something about that. But let's take a break before we get into that. Let's do the Google Forms and see if we can get that to work. So you'll need your phone, probably your camera will do this for you, or if you have a QR code reader. So I'm going to, oh yeah, discard. Okay, let me pull up the QR code. Okay, so if you get that, and if you have to stand up to get a good angle, go for it. And then it should take you into form where it's asking for your email address, name, what's your major. Are you getting there? Okay, so if you could please answer those. I'd like that data. And then submit. What's pretty neat, as I'm in my side of the Google Forms, I can see like responses coming in and who's giving responses and data. Data, gotta love data. But unless I make it a multiple choice, like I ask, what's your major? And of course, people will type it in differently, so I'm getting lots of answers, even though they should all be. But anyways, I'll collate the data and show you next time what the major distribution is here with all of us. And then some of the other things that you've answered about topics and so forth, I'll try to incorporate some of your interests into future lectures. So it's always fun I like the things that you are wanting to know about. So it always helps me go out and learn more too. So I find it interesting to do that.
I can't remember if we talked about this the first day, but do you have a favorite plant?
Oh, boy. It's like, which child do you love better? Um, yeah.
The one that's like up there doesn't have to fade.
Do you have a child you like that?
No. Probably my favorite tree long-term, since I was a little girl, is aspens. I love the way the leaves dance in the wind. I've just been fascinated with that. And I actually learned that aspen leaves, because they dance around so much, they put stomata on both sides of their leaves, more than just on their underside, because they dance around so much. Yeah, I spent many a time on my back looking up at aspen leaves in the summer and just loving that. But then I went and saw the giant sequoias and was just blown away, but we don't have those here. I grew up here, so yeah, it's hard to pick. I'll have to ask all that out to you as well in one of the future Google Forms. And then like other plants, like a herbaceous plant, oh my goodness. Well, one of the most fascinating, but I didn't learn about it until I was teaching here, is the it's a plant that can mimic. Have you heard about this one? It can mimic plants around itself. It's a tropical vine. I've not seen it with my own eyes. I've seen pictures in published papers and so forth. Trifoliate. Oh, what's the first? I'm blanking on the genus name. I'll bring it up in a future lecture here.
Like physically mimic or
Yeah.
what?
Yep, it changes its leaf shape.
I didn't know. Where is that?
Well, exactly. So now they're saying plants can see. So in my advanced botany class, we kind of get into this a lot, like the 5 senses of plants. Plants can see, plants can hear, plants can taste, plants can smell. And then, of course, that sounds really, really ridiculous. But if you look at, well, what is sight? What is smell? What is taste? If you think about it down at the cell level, they are doing all of that. It's just they do it with their own version because they don't have eyes, they don't have ears, but
What is their version of science? Is it too complicated to get into?
take my advanced botany class. It's a fun class. So, okay, I think we have most everyone responding, so thank you for doing that. So the Google Forms I will be using rather than the iClicker, because Google Forms is free and it does even more than what I like when you can write out sentences, and iClicker you can't do that. So that was really limiting for an instructor. And I can get immediate feedback, which is what I want, so I can work with that as I continue my time with you. So please come prepared to do that. It's not necessarily every lecture I'll be doing this, but frequently I'm going to try to do it more and more. And then sometimes it might just be for attendance purposes. Sometimes it's participation points. I rarely will do a pop quiz that's like significant points. If I do that, I'll tell you ahead of time, like, hey, we're going to have a quiz on such and such a date, and it'll be 10 points. But if I do something like a Google form, like quiz question, it'd be like a question, and so if you're not here that day, it's don't worry about it. Okay. And so just come prepared to do the Google Forms. It looks like it was pretty straightforward for all of you. I think some of you have said you've done it before, so if I run into any glitch, hopefully there's enough brain power in here that we can figure it out. But it's way easier than iClicker. Like I said, my laptop does not work with iClicker for some reason. It's possessed. I can't wait to get rid of it. This fall, I think I finally can get a new one. They make us keep our laptops for 4 years. 4 years in computer life. That's like an antique. All right, let's go back. So we need to figure out we need to figure out how is the plant doing this? How is it able to tell how long it's in the light versus the dark? And it is a group of pigments, photoreceptors, that are called phytochromes. And this was, again, decades in the making, and they still don't know everything. Although a former botany student, Jeremiah, he was first author on a paper describing the three-dimensional aspect of this photoreceptor. And did his undergraduate here, and then he went on for his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he did research with me and worked in my lab while he was here. When he first came in, he was one of my advisees, and I said, "What's your major?" "Not botany." I'm like, "Okay." Like, why? And he said, "I grew up on a farm and I had to work the farm since I was a kid. I'm tired of plants." And I'm like, "Okay." And so, but gee, halfway through his sophomore year, he wanted to do research in my lab. Well, guess what we're working on? Plants. So it was plants or nothing. So he got back into plants and realized how fascinating plants can be when you don't have to be pulling weeds all summer. And he ended up switching to botany, and then his PhD was all about plants. I just love it. So I just had to chuckle at that. So you just never know what happens when you take a class that really can change things, or do research that can change things for you. Okay, so phytochromes are really, they're pigment proteins, they're photoreceptors that control this idea of being able to figure out, how long am I in the light, how long am I in the dark? And it is a pale blue proteinaceous pigment. You don't really need to know that, but in case you're wondering. And it's typically found in meristematic tissue. So remember, that's areas of the plant body that's usually actively growing most of the time. So, shoot tips, root tips, axillary buds. They even think that buds on deciduous trees that are protecting the young leaves over winter here, they have those pigments there. And that's one way they know when to go ahead and leaf out in the spring. So what they find is that these pigments have two stable forms. There's a so-called P sub R form of the pigment. And the reason they have the subscript R, that stands for red light. So phytochrome red is, or I say P sub R for the subscript R. So P sub R, that form of the pigment, absorbs red light. It's ready to absorb red light, and that's what it will absorb. So let's imagine P sub R is in the plant body, it absorbs red light, then what happens? It actually switches to the P sub FR form, which they call the far red light form. And I'll show you a picture in a second here. And so this pigment, this photoreceptor, can kind of toggle back and forth into being a P sub R version of phytochrome or the PFR version of phytochrome. And they actually change their shape, and that's how it's able to absorb these different qualities of light. It's because of the way that they're shaped when the light hits them. And so it is this ratio of these two pigments. How much P sub R do I have in my body versus how much P sub FR do I have in my body? And they're actually assessing that ratio. And that ratio will tell them, am I in the light or am I in the dark? So here's a schematic trying to get across this point that you have the P sub R form over on the left. And what they're trying to show is if that gets hit with red light, if that version of phytochrome gets hit with red light, then it converts over to the P sub FR form. Now, once it's in that form, it's well adapted to absorb far red light. So if you then expose the plant to far red light, it toggles back to the P sub R form. It's pretty funky. The other thing that can happen is overnight. If you have a lot of P sub FR in the plant body, let's say, overnight, just slowly through the night, it can convert back over to P sub R. Okay, now P sub FR, they're calling the active form. What they mean by that is that when the phytochrome is in that form, it will tend to interact. So they say biological response. What it does is it goes into the nucleus and interacts with transcription factors that can change gene expression. So as you know, not all of the genes on the chromosomes of a plant or a human are up and running all the time. We just couldn't do it. So many genes are on, many genes are off. And so it's the piece about FR form that will go into the nucleus and start interacting with certain transcription factors to get certain genes turned on, hopefully, so the plant can respond appropriately to whatever it's going on with regard to light versus dark. Okay, so here's another image of the phytochrome. So when I said it changed shape, this is what we're trying to get across here. So the P sub R form doesn't, it kind of looks like an M to me. I call it the M form in my head. All right, it kind of looks like an M. When it gets hit with red light and absorbs it, it shifts its physical shape to a Y. So that's the piece of FR form. If you take the piece of FR form of phytochrome and hit it with far red light, it goes back to an M. You're like doing the YMCA dance, right? So it's just a physical shift. It's pretty elegant that the plant can have this very kind of simple mechanism where this version will maximally absorb red light that gets it into the piece of FR form, which maximally absorbs far red light, and it goes back and forth depending on what quality of light the plant is seeing more of. So if the plant's seeing lots of red light hitting its body, that means in its tissues, it's going to have a lot of the piece of FR form. Okay. But if the plant is getting, wow, I'm getting a lot of far red light, then it's going to shift to the piece of R form. And so what the plant is really doing is assessing how much piece of FR do I have? How much piece of R do I have? And that tells it if it's in the light or the dark. It can be for the whole plant body, but you can also imagine a tree where some of the leaves are in direct sunlight, some are getting shaded out. So in that case, you would have different ratios in the shaded leaf versus the fully lit leaf. Okay, so you have to think about shading effects. Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, but I think you.
Okay. So, and then you can see here, nuclear import. So they're saying this, the piece of FR form tends to be the one to shift gene expression. Okay. So the P stands for the phytochrome. This is the phytochrome pigment, the photoreceptor. The chromophore, by the way, that's the actual part that absorbs the light quality. And then when that happens, it causes a physical shift. So please look this over. I know the first time I learned this, it's like I had to really think through it slowly. Okay. We're going to go through this again on Wednesday and explain a little bit more about what, how the plant uses this information. We'll stop there.